Good morning, everyone. I hope I'm audible. Now, in post-independence India, only three topics are left. That is ecology and environment. Post-independence, Nehru's foreign policy. Finally, communalism in India post-independence. Right. First, we are going to talk about ecology and environment. Now, before 1972, that is the Stockholm Conference, India's policy was focused primarily upon growth and development, as is reflected in the various policy orientations of the first or initial 5-year plans. There was little regard for environmental issues. And why was this? Due to lack of knowledge about the effects that unmitigated industrial growth or agricultural expansion can have on the ecology and environment. Secondly, the immediate needs of the country. Much of India was doomed to a future of perpetual poverty, and it was important to lift India's regions out of it. There was threat of starvation almost every year. Industrial output was extremely low, and the country was suffering because of lack of self-sufficiency. Therefore, first, the developmental needs of the people had to be fulfilled, and only then could we start worrying about environmental issues. Thirdly, there was no international environmental movement that existed at that point of time. Right? The industrial countries were fighting in the Cold War against each other, Soviets on one side and the Americans on the other. On the other hand, there had emerged no alliance of environmentally conscious individuals or groups who could pressurize their governments to take a more holistic approach towards the process of economic development. And as a result, environmental issues were not even on the radar. Right? Further, India's economy, even after the initial push towards industrialization, was primarily agricultural. And the initial environmental movement was targeting industrial ventures, not agriculture. Okay? And as a result, the initial push towards the responsible growth affected India. Okay? So between 1947 and 1972, very few efforts were made in order to protect biodiversity or the environment. Apart from a few acts such as the Water Prevention of Pollution Act or the Air Prevention of Pollution Act, Air Act, Water Act, ये सब आ गए थे. But apart from that, not much progress had been made. Okay? So give the subheading background. Write down. In the initial years after independence, comma, there was no specific environmental policy. There was no specific environmental policy. Stop. This period witnessed greater stress. On economic growth, and infrastructure development. With little concern, infrastructure development, economic growth and infrastructure development, with little concern for environmental degradation. Next point. There was no single body / institution to oversee environmental protection. The primary environmental issues fell under the ambit of sewage disposal, sanitation, public health, and forest regulation. These were handled by different ministries and departments. Primarily at the which level? Central level or state level? No, state subjects. Okay? At the state level. Abhi the state subjects apart from forests. Next point. At the same time, comma, a few provisions were introduced to tackle problems such as destruction of forests, unplanned urban growth, and the emerging problem of water pollution. So these included the Factories Act, 1948, the River Boards Act, 1956, and the Mines and Minerals Regulation and Development Act, 1967. Which was next point. This reflects the lack of any unified effort in developing a policy to tackle pollution from these sources. Instead, efforts were scattered and sporadic. Next point. At the same time, there was growing concern with regards to the rising population, comma, its polluting effects, comma, resource depletion, and its impact on forests and wildlife. Sorry. Next main point. The first turning point was the Stockholm Conference, 1972, which was followed by a series of environmental protection laws as well as economic planning with a focus on clean and sustainable development, as well as economic planning with a focus on clean and sustainable development. So give a new subheading: efforts to combat biodiversity loss and pollution post Stockholm Conference. में क्या देखा है that this was the turning point when it came to framing a specific and unified policy by India towards environmental degradation and destruction of biodiversity. देखिए एक एक करके Wildlife Protection Act, (1972), Wildlife Protection Act 1972. Objective: prevent the decline of animal and bird population. Prevent the decline of animal and bird population. Next point. It prohibits the killing of certain species killing of certain species of animals is prohibited except for the research of scientific research and education. Next point. It empowers state governments to declare any area to be a wildlife sanctuary or national park ठीक है तो कुछ क्राइटेरिया स्पेसिफाई किए गए हैं फॉर एग्जांपल in the state government's estimation this area must have some ecological faunal or floral value or geological value which makes its preservation important or its demarcation important as a protected area to protect the species which inhabit it. Next लिखो the water Prevention of Pollution Act, 1974. 1974. Write down. It provided for the creation of Central Pollution Control Board and State Pollution Control Boards. Next, लिखो Forest Conservation Act 1980. It provided for, sorry, it aimed at checking deforestation, checking deforestation, and diversion of forest land for non-forestry purpose. Stop. Next point. It also promoted social forestry. ठीक है? Next main point लिखो. The Air Prevention of Pollution Act 1981. Prevention of Pollution Act 1981. Stop. It empowered the central and state pollution control boards, CPCB, and the central and state SPCBs, central and state pollution control boards, to monitor and check air pollution. Full stop. Point. It also empowered the central and state governments to adopt policies and measures to identify the sources of air pollution, and frame policies to check it. Okay? What was the focus of these acts? To improve the quality of life while protecting the wildlife. Write down clearly. Next main point. Clearly, comma. These acts were designed to protect the natural environment, and improve the quality of life by checking pollution by checking pollution, comma, deforestation, deforestation, and and protecting wildlife and the natural environment. And the natural environment. ठीक है, लेकिन क्या नहीं फोकस था इन एक्ट्स का? To protect the rights of the wildlife and the people affected by economic development. So, because of rapid industrialization and expansion of agriculture, the extension of railways and other means of transport and communication, अभी भी कई सारी communities directly affect हो रही हैं, right? However, those were neglected in the interest of economic growth. It was felt that what the government was doing under the aegis of such acts was sufficient, and there was very little focus on settling environmental disputes. Next main point. However, 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 comma, there was little focus. There was little focus on the resolution of industrial and environmental disputes. Resolution of industrial and environmental disputes. Stop. Further, polluting industries and activities were not sufficiently checked. And it is in this background that India would get another major shock in the form of the Bhopal gas tragedy. 1980. Write down. Next main point. The next major turning point in the evolution of India's environmental policy came in the form of the Bhopal Gas Tragedy. Bhopal Gas Tragedy. Next subheading though. Environmental reforms after the Bhopal Gas Tragedy. After the Bhopal Gas Tragedy. Reforms after the Bhopal Gas Tragedy. ठीक है, write down. The Environment Protection Act 1986. Environment Protection Act 1986. It was a landmark. in India's evolving environment protection framework. Okay. Point. By plugging the loopholes in existing legislation, comma, it centered the focus of the country towards environment protection. Towards environment protection. Towards environment protection. Next point. It primarily tackles pollution with stringent penalties for violators. Stringent penalties for violators. ठीक है? Next, the Public Liability Insurance Act. In 91. Public Liability Insurance Act 1991. क्या प्रोवाइड करेगा? कोई भी इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर प्रोजेक्ट है या फिर इंडस्ट्रियल प्रोजेक्ट है, they will have to have insurance. Why? In order to mitigate the negative effects of their activities, and in the case of calamity, to provide compensation to affected people and communities. Next one, sorry, इसमें लिखो आगे. It provides mandatory insurance cover for the purpose of providing immediate relief to persons affected by accidents involving persons affected by accidents involving any hazardous material. Next, the National Environment Tribunals Act 1995. Environment Tribunals Act, National Environment Tribunals Act 1995. ये क्यों सेटअप करे गए एनवायरमेंट ट्रिब्यूनल्स? सिविल कोर्ट में जो लिटिगेशन होता था, दैट वाज अ वेरी लॉन्ग टाइम टेकिंग प्रोसेस, एंड रिलीफ दैट पीपल वर आस्किंग फॉर वाज unnecessarily delayed because of this long litigation. So quick redressal के लिए these tribunals were set. Write down. Civil courts civil courts took a long time to dispose all disputes, including environmental disputes. So, next point. This act provided for speedy disposal of environmental cases to the National Environment Tribunal that had 4 benches. Environment Tribunal is the precursor to the NGT, National Green Tribunal. National Environment Tribunal, which had 4 benches. कहाँ पर? At Delhi, Mumbai, Calcutta, and Chennai. Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras. Okay. Next point. The National Environment Appellate Authority Act. National Environment Appellate Authority Act, 1997. It provided for the establishment of a National Environment Appellate Authority, of a NEAA, of the National Environment Appellate Authority, NEAA, to hear appeals with respect to restriction in any areas in which any industries, operations, or processes may or may not be carried out, subject to the safeguards provided by the Environmental Protection Act, 1986. Okay. So this act had empowered the SCPBs and the SPCBs and the CPCB to either allow or restrict the setting up of any industry, the operation of any activity or process in particular areas with certain safeguards. So some communities are going to be happy with this, some groups are going to be unhappy. तो कहाँ पे लेकर के जाएंगे अपील्स को? NEAA में लेकर के. एंड नेक्स्ट देखो, द नेशनल बायोडाइवर्सिटी एक्ट 2000 write down. This act offers assistance to communities involved in the protection of biodiversity around them. Offers protection to, or offers assistance to communities involved in the protection of biodiversity around them. Protection of biodiversity around them. Full stop. It facilitates scientific access to genetic material while protecting the traditional knowledge of biodiversity conservation. Traditional knowledge of biodiversity conservation. Okay? The purpose of this act is clearly to align modern science and traditional knowledge when it comes to biodiversity protection. So these were the post 1984 environmental protection efforts. Does that mean that there were no ground level efforts or movements in India to protect the environment? No, there were several. Okay. So environmental movements in India post-independence. Environmental movements in India post-independence. Write down. A large number of environmental movements emerged in India during and after environmental movements emerged in India during and after the 1970s. So, next point. Initially they emerged as a local response to local issues. But gradually they coalesced, COALECED, coalesced into a national movement for environmentalism. into a national movement for environmentalism. पहले अलग अलग जहाँ पे अलग अलग पॉकेट्स में बिकॉज ऑफ डिफरेंट लोकल इश्यूज दीज मूवमेंट्स इमर्ज. ठीक है, लोकल एनवायरमेंटल प्रोटेक्शन मूवमेंट्स इमर्ज हुए, बट ग्रेजुअली one movement became entered an alliance with the other movement, and gradually India का जो environmental movement है, environmentalism का movement है, that was born. Write down. Broadly, next main point. Broadly, the emergence of the Indian environmental movements may be attributed to factors such as control over natural resources, Number 2, misguided developmental policies of the government. Guided developmental policies of the government, resulting in centralized top-down planning. Resulting from centralized top-down planning. But 3, environmental degradation or destruction, causing socio-economic distress or destruction, causing socio-economic distress. ठीक है, in the name of economic development, for example, the central and state governments started providing for major infrastructure projects which required often the felling of trees and the destruction of forests. But there were several communities which were embedded in those forest landscapes, and they faced a great degree of socio-economic distress due to this. And this was another factor for the rising environmentalist movement in it. Finally, लिखो, rising awareness about the importance of the ecological balance and environmental protection through literature and media. Literature and media. Through literature and media. For example, the publication of Silent Spring, 1960, by Rachel Carson. ठीक है, थीम क्या है? Spring is usually the time for songbirds to sing their songs, right? Silent spring matlab all the birds are gone now. Why have they gone away? Because of modern industrialized agriculture as well as the expansion of modern industries, their polluting effects. So the spring has fallen silent. So it throws light upon the effect of pollution upon the natural habitat. And this took the entire world by storm. It was reprinted in several languages and widely published. It sold more than 1 million copies, 10 lakh copies in India alone. Okay? You can appreciate the kind of effect that it had on the popular consciousness and the dangers of unmitigated economic growth. And it also puts focus upon the need for promoting sustainable development. So that, along with some other media organizations, which also started shedding focus upon the polluting, the negative effects of some major infrastructure projects or industrial projects. So because of this rising awareness, along with all the other issues, there was the growth of local movements. Next point, लिखो. Next subheading लिखो इसमें. Major movements. वही movement. वो आंदोलन. नर्मदा बचाओ आंदोलन. साइलेंट वैली मूवमेंट. टिटको मूवमेंट, एटसेट्रा. सबसे पहला बिश्नोई मूवमेंट, लेड बाय अमृता देवी. लेड बाय अमृता देवी in Rajasthan. In Rajasthan. To prevent poaching of wildlife, poaching of wildlife, from deforestation, deforestation, and combat desertification, and combat desertification. Next point. More than 363 members of the Bishnoi community, sacrifice their lives, in the conflict against powerful local elements, in the conflicts against powerful local elements and the government. Next point. The Bishnoi movement represents a unique blend of environmentalism with religious spiritualism. The community considers all life to be sacred, while environmentalism is a scientific doctrine. And that is why it is considered to be a unique lens. It shows how the old and new can also synthesize in order to protect the environment. Next, लिखो चिपको आंदोलन. चिपको आंदोलन led by activists such as Sundarlal Bahuguna, Chandi Prasad Bhatt, Gaura Devi, and others. In which part of India? In the forested hilly areas of Uttarakhand. So, why was it called the Chipko movement? It refers to tree hugging. Okay? So, this was a movement to prevent the felling of trees and the deforestation of the forests of hilly areas of Uttarakhand. तो यहाँ पर सबसे worst affected parts of the population कौन थे? The policy of deforestation की वजह से सबसे ज़्यादा worst affected कौन थे? Women, local women. Why? Because they had the primary responsibility of gathering forest firewood and forest produce. They were also in charge of cattle rearing, for which they needed to take their cows and buffaloes into the forests, grazing purposes. And since they were the worst affected, while the movement was led by both men as well as women, participation was largely of women. How did they prevent the forest officials from cutting down the trees? By hugging them. चिपक जाते थे trees से. Right? Write down. Next point. The Chipko movement gets its name from the tactic used by the activists to prevent the felling of trees. So stop. Namely, hugging the trees. Point 2. Women played a leading role in the movement, since deforestation affected them directly. So stop. This was because women were primarily responsible for gathering firewood and pastoral activities. Both these activities required easy access to healthy forests. Next point. The Chipko movement thus emerged as a major step not only towards the democratization of environmentalism, the democratization of environmentalism. So, environmentalism was not simply the purview of a few university graduates who understood the nitty-gritties of environmental protection and its importance, but it involved the ordinary people, but also environmentalism, but also the growth of feminist influence within environmental, within environment. Influence within environmentalism. And यहाँ से क्या होगा? Since these women have come together on a common platform, it is going to be very difficult to disperse them. And they are going to remain part of that platform, which is not only going to be interested in environmental protection, but also looking after women's issues. They are also going to have a major say in local and ultimately and in national politics. ठीक है? So, जेंडर एम्पावरमेंट और एनवायरमेंटलिज्म के बीच में अब एक अलायंस, दैट इज द पॉइंट. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट लिखो, नर्मदा बचाओ आंदोलन. नर्मदा बचाओ आंदोलन. Who was the pioneer? मेधा पटकर. ठीक है, राइट डाउन. Pioneered by मेधा पाटेकर. पाटेकर. It opposed the Narmada River Valley project. Right? Geography में आप लोगों ने पढ़ा होगा that the Narmada River flows through a rift valley, और इसमें वेस्ट टू ईस्ट जैसे जैसे जाते रहते हैं वैसे वैसे एलिवेशन घटता रहता है. And this plan, the project envisaged the construction of dams at different descending elevations so that water reservoirs could be created and the surrounding areas could be provided with drinking as well as water for irrigation purposes. ठीक है, तो ये पर्पज है. However, what Medha Patekar and her followers said that the government has not yet told us what the negative effects of this river valley project are, how it is going to adversely affect the sensitive ecology of the Vindhya region. वो नहीं पता चला है आपको. How it is going to affect the lives of the grazing communities that inhabit these regions, वो नहीं पता लगा है, right? So this movement was the beginning of the movement against the incorporation of ambitious infrastructure projects and developmental projects without sufficient scientific appraisal of its environmental as well as social. ठीक है, write down. Next main point क्या लिखा है आपने? of the Narmada Valley project ना. हाँ, next main point. It has emphasized upon the social, environmental, and economic risks associated with such projects, such projects, such projects. Full stop. It also brings focus on issues such as forced displacement, forced displacement, next point. It has directly contributed to the introduction of tools such as environmental and social assessments of major projects, as well as the incorporation of specific guidelines to resettle and rehabilitate of specific guidelines, incorporation of specific guidelines to resettle and rehabilitate displaced communities. Next देखो, Silent Valley movement, displaced communities, resettle and rehabilitate displaced communities. Next heading, next one, Silent Valley movement. साइलेंट वैली किसको बोलते हैं? नीलगिरी हिल्स एरिया को, राइट? तो यहाँ पर बिकॉज ऑफ इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट फॉरेस्ट वर बीइंग क्लियर्ड and these were tropical rainforests which could not easily be replanted, right? So uske against protest, a series of protests took place in the Silent Valley to protect the ecology, the dense tropical and temperate forests, and against hydroelectricity projects planned for this region. Finally, a PICO movement. It emerged in the Uttar Kannada district of Karnataka with the following objectives. A, B, and C. restoring forests in the denuded areas, restoring forests in the denuded areas. A, restoring forests in the denuded areas. B, protecting existing forest cover. Protecting existing forest cover. And C, utilizing forest wealth with consideration for the conservation of natural resources. Point. Like the Chipko movement, it was a grassroots movement of local communities against the degradation of natural forests due to infrastructure development, degradation of natural forests due to infrastructure development, comma, industrial expansion due to infrastructure expansion, and commercial exploitation. ठीक है? Next subheading दो, nature of India's environmental movement. Nature of India's environmental movement. क्या देखने के लिए मिल रहा है हमें? एकदम began as localized movements, but coalesced into a national environmental alliance. What kinds of movements have these been? Violent or non-violent ones? Non-violent, right now. They have been they have been non-violent movements relying upon the use of constitutional methods. Have they been democratic movements? How? First of all, they have not been orchestrated by any major leader, rather they have been grassroots movements. And secondly, all of these movements have stood for democracy. Okay? So they are in the shape of movements that are asking for the preservation of what they consider to be the democratic rights of the activists. Right down. They have strong democratic credentials. As most of them are grassroots movements. And fight for what they believe are the democratic rights of the local communities. Of the local community. Are they based purely on modern scientific principles? No, they represent a synthesis between modern science as well as traditional knowledge to safeguard the environment and protect the ecology. Write down. Next main point. Sorry, next point. Uh, they represent a synthesis between modern science and traditional knowledge. Modern science and traditional knowledge. These movements have been orchestrated by local communities and in some leaders out, in some cases outsiders such as Medha Patekar, etc. However, would it be correct to say that they have not been able to attract many national and international NGOs? गलत हो गया ऐसे कहना, right? Next point लिखो. These movements have been able to attract a large number of NGOs and groups, both domestic and foreign. Both domestic and foreign. Full stop. Next point. Have they always taken the shape of acting as a hurdle against economic development, or have they also been able to come with constructive solutions to promote sustainable development? They have been constructive in, right now. India's environmental movement has remained constructive rather than obstructive when it comes to economic development. When it comes to economic development. So, they have found creative solutions to solve the dilemma of growth versus environmentalism. The dilemma of growth versus environmentalism by adopting the strategy of sustainable development with a focus on conservation and inclusivity. With a focus on conservation and inclusivity. Sustainable development with a focus on conservation and inclusivity. Okay? These were the different movements. Next, Nehru's Foreign policy. Now, what were the foreign policy challenges that India faced post-independence? First of all, let us tackle them challenges. Number one, war with Pakistan. Number two, border disputes. Number three, Cold War era, bloc politics. Number four, the need of foreign aid. Number five was the idea that India should not remain a silent spectator while the big superpowers dictate policy. Rather, it should be a positive contributor to the process of international relations. To transform India into a world leader, और बताइए क्या challenges overcome करने थे? To influence international relations with a view to combat colonialism and racism. Finally, to prevent global conflict. These are the challenges before point. Background. Of Nehru's foreign policy. In 1928, Nehru became the Congress's official foreign representative. He traveled extensively, not 1928, 1924, traveled extensively, including the International Decolonization Conference at Brussels in 1927. He also traveled to the Soviet Union and to several Asian and African countries. ठीक है? Was also deeply inspired by socialism due to its ideological opposition to colonialism and racism, which were the two biggest threats to peace in the early 20th century. He was equally inspired by Gandhian principles, namely non-violence and self-rule, which shaped his views regarding international conflict, the resolution of international disputes, and the idea of decolonization. Okay. This was the background of the Nehruvian foreign policy. Next point. Nehru's foreign policy principles क्या क्या है ये? नॉन अलाइनमेंट, पंचशील, decolonization, promotion of international peace through dialogue, was he a supporter of international institutions of diplomacy or not? Yes. Internationalism. Non-alignment, what did it stand for? तो इसको expand करो. Non-alignment. It stood for active neutrality during the Cold War. मतलब क्या हुआ इसका? किसी की साइड नहीं लेंगे, लेकिन ऐसा भी नहीं होगा कि दोनों के अगेंस्ट होंगे, दोनों के साथ. राइट डाउन. In the era of bloc politics, Nehru advocated a third path, distinct from both capitalism and communism. Which stood for and communism, a distinct third path, distinct from both capitalism and communism, which stood for equal cooperation with both superpowers for which purpose? For economic growth or economic development. Both superpowers for economic development. Right. Punch sheet. It outlined 5 principles on the basis of which international relations, especially between neighbors, should be conducted. These included, especially between neighbors, should be conducted. These included क्या क्या है? A B C D E करके लिखो. Mutual non-aggression, mutual non-aggression, B, mutual respect of international boundaries and territorial sovereignty. Sovereignty. Next point. C. Territorial sovereignty. C. Mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs. Each other's internal affairs. D. Equality and cooperation for mutual benefit. Equality and cooperation for mutual benefit. And E. Decolonization. Sorry, peaceful coexistence. Peaceful coexistence. Next principle. Decolonization. Decolonization. Nehru envisioned a world free of colonialism. Free of colonialism. With India as a leader of the newly decolonized countries. Of the newly decolonized countries. Stop. Point. He condemned French aggression in Africa and Southeast Asia. Africa and Southeast Asia. After the Second World War. After the Second World War. Next point. He also condemned the joint British and French, joint British and French invasion of Egypt in 1956, Suez crisis जो था, right? Next main point. हाँ, 1947, he laid the foundations of the Asian Relations Conference. Laid the foundation of the Asian Relations Conference. With its first summit at Delhi, its Asian Relations Conference, ARC. Its first summit at Delhi. ठीक है, तो 1947 में एक समिट हुआ, 1949 में एक समिट हुआ, दोनों दिल्ली में हुए. नेक्स्ट मेजर कॉन्फ्रेंस summit took place in 1955 at Bandung in Indonesia. एंड यहाँ पे क्या फ्लोट किया गया? दी नॉन अलाइंड मूवमेंट. ठीक है, दी ARC, हाँ सब पॉइंट, दी ARC represented the assertion of the newly independent Asian countries to determine their own fate, free from superpower influence. It's the point. At the Bandung Conference, at the Bandung Summit or the Bandung Conference, 1955, Nehru, 1955, Nehru floated the creation of the NAM, non-aligned movement. The creation of the NAM. And the next year, NAM का पहला समिट होता है in 1956 at Belgrade. ठीक है, तो ये हो गया decolonization. Next, international peace through dialogue. International peace through dialogue. Nehru was a subscriber to the idea that international disputes must be resolved through mutual dialogue. Stop. During the Korean War, he became, or he emerged as the negotiator between the two sides. Negotiator between the two sides. Okay. Next, internationalism. Internationalism. Nehru was a supporter of international institutions such as the UNO, World Bank, and IMF. कैसे पता लगता है? He submitted the Kashmir dispute to resolution by the UN in 1948. He also took the river dispute, the water dispute between India and Pakistan to arbitration in the UN. और UN ने किसको दिया responsibility? World Bank को. ठीक है? Write down. This is reflected. Yeah. Acha was a supporter of international institutions such as the UNO, World Bank, and IMF. UNO, World Bank, and IMF. सब पॉइंट लिखो. He unilaterally referred the Kashmir issue to the UN for resolution. UN for a resolution. That's the point. Similarly, the Indus Water Treaty 1960 was finalized between India and Pakistan to the World Bank. Okay. While he wanted to prevent war and believed that international peace is possible only through dialogue, would it be correct to characterize Nehru as a pacifist, as a non-believer in war, or as a person who believed in complete disarmament? No. From the very beginning, he had a very clear understanding that national defense was one of the important foreign policy priorities. And Nehru was also not a pacifist. So there is a difference between being an aggressor and being a pacifist. Being an aggressor means that you use your armed forces in order to disturb international peace. Nehru did not believe in doing that. अगर कोई dispute है तो पहले हम लड़ाई नहीं शुरू करें. We are going to talk in international forums or through bilateral dialogue and find a solution. But what is going to be the answer to aggression? Not pacifism. वो ईंट का जवाब पत्थर से दिया जाए. That was the idea. Write down. Next main point. At the same time, Nehru was not a pacifist. Full stop. While he did not believe in the violent resolution of disputes, violent resolution of disputes, comma. He also felt that national defense is the most important objective. Defense is the most important objective of foreign policy. Of foreign policy. Aspect of foreign policy. Most important aspect of foreign policy. Subpoint. As such, in 1948, he laid the foundations of the AEC. क्या है ये? Atomic Energy Corporation, with the purpose of making India a nuclear state. ठीक है? In India a nuclear state. Similarly, in 1949, laid the foundations of the NDA. क्या है ये? National Defense Academy, with the purpose of AC, with the purpose of making India a nuclear state. Purpose of India a nuclear state. So, similarly, the NDA was established in 1949 to strengthen the armed forces. The armed forces. ठीक है? These were the principles. Next, major foreign policy moves of Nehru. क्या है ये? 1950, 1940, 1950. London Declaration, through which India joined the Commonwealth and the British Commonwealth was renamed as the Commonwealth of Nations. ठीक है? Changes were also made to the Constitution of the Commonwealth. क्या? पहले it consisted of only the dominions of the British Empire, but now it would consist of the former colonies which had now become a republic. Okay. Now, Nehru faced much criticism for this. There was a group which felt that India should have no association with its colonial past, and the Commonwealth was the living successor of the British Empire. So, India should not be part of that. Second problem was that although British Commonwealth is नाम change कर दिया था to Commonwealth of Nations, and although republics were also allowed to join it, but the British monarch continued to remain as the head of the Commonwealth of Nations. So this was against India's legacy of complete independence, which had demanded since 1929, and this was in fact something that Nehru himself had spearheaded. This was seen as a great betrayal by many nationalists, especially right-wing nationalists. Nehru का response क्या था? I want to show the world that India has the self-confidence to engage even with those with whom she has had a quarrel in the past. Given that the terms of this engagement should be those of mutual cooperation and benefit. एक ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए कि एक इसमें बड़ा होगा दूसरा छोटा होगा. इक्वालिटी के टर्म्स पे होना चाहिए एंड म्यूचुअल बेनिफिट दोनों को राइट. तो लंदन डिक्लेरेशन वाज दैट. नेक्स्ट लिखो 1950 दिल्ली पैक्ट. between Nehru and Liaquat Ali Khan. Now, both India and Pakistan में partition के बाद से बहुत ज़्यादा law and order issues हो रहे थे because of the refugees, right? And communalism was also rising. So both these leaders met at Delhi, and after 6 days of discussions, they signed the Delhi Pact. क्या decide किया गया? That property and relatives lost by the refugees on both sides would be repatriated to them. Secondly, the refugees would be allowed to return to their original places for settling their property and finding their relatives, mostly women who had been abducted. And thirdly, that safe passage would be given to any future migrants. So those who wanted to migrate from India to Pakistan, or those who wanted to migrate from Pakistan to India, they would not be attacked and they would be provided legal protection. So right now, it sought to resolve the disputes caused by the refugee crisis. और इस रेफ्यूजी क्राइसिस की वजह से इंडिया पाकिस्तान के बीच में दोबारा लड़ाई होने वाली थी. दिस वुड हैव बीन द सेकंड वॉर बिटवीन इंडिया एंड पाकिस्तान विद इन 3 years ऑफ देयर कॉन्फ्लिक्ट. एक तो शुरू में ही हो गई थी बनते ही. दूसरी नेक्स्ट लिखो 1947 एशियन रिलेशंस कॉन्फ्रेंस. एशियन रिलेशंस कॉन्फ्रेंस. नेक्स्ट लिखो 1956 non-aligned movement. 1956 Panchsheel agreement between India and China. India and China. 1962 India China war. इशू क्या था? What was the main issue? China accused India of violating the Panchsheel agreement. क्या? Dalai Lama, the 14th spiritual leader of the Tibetan Buddhists, had been given political asylum by India. China felt, or China accused India of interfering with its internal issues. Right? That was a violation of the Panchsheel agreement. इंडिया ने भी एक्यूजेशन लगाया चाइना के ऊपर, क्या, that China has violated the Panchshil agreement because it has started mounting its troops on the international border between India and China. China has started to patrol the border areas and has started preparing for war. This was seen as a threat to India and preparation for war that would have threatened the agreement with regards to mutual respect of international borders and territorial sovereignty. Right? Now, Nehru expected that India and China would be able to settle all their disputes mutually. कई सारे बॉर्डर इश्यूज थे इंडिया और चाइना के बीच में, सिंस जो ड्यूरन लाइन है दैट वाज डिमार्केटेड बाय द ब्रिटिश, द चाइनीज रिजेक्टेड इट. हाउएवर देयर वर इंडिकेशंस दैट दे वर रेडी टू टॉक. नेहरू वांटेड दैट हर सेक्टर के लिए अलग अलग बैठ करके ग्रेजुअली डिस्प्यूट्स को रिजॉल्व किया जाए. चाइना वांटेड दैट द एंटायर बॉर्डर इशू मस्ट बी रिजॉल्व्ड. दैट वाज नॉट पॉसिबल. This had become the background for the mounting of Chinese troops along the border. Right? दलाई लामा को जैसे ही asylum दिया, तो China found an opportunity and in an unprovoked manner it invaded. Right? Result क्या हुआ? India was entirely unprepared and it was losing. Right? Jawaharlal Nehru appealed to both the Soviets as well as the Americans to provide assistance against the Chinese aggression. China was obviously the violator of international peace. But both the Soviets and the Americans were busy at this point of time. Why? Because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and none of them were able to respond. By the time the response came, it was already quite late. China had already made several advances deep into Indian territory, and जो Indian forward positions थी, they had suffered quite heavily. India had lost the war, and before the foreigners, the other powers could intervene, China unilaterally withdrew its forces from India, but it maintained its presence in certain sectors such as Aksai Chin, etc. Right? So they were permanently now under Chinese occupation. This came as a huge shock to me. Why? क्योंकि उनका जो आइडियलिज्म था, उनका जो इंटरनेशनलिज्म था, पंचशील में बिलीव था, दैट वाज एंटायरली shattered. And from this point onwards, Nehru became more realistic in his expectations. क्या किया इन्होंने? Tibetan Revolutionary Force का creation किया, and he adopted a new policy towards the deployment of Indian forces along international borders. अब क्या policy अपनाएंगे? Forward policy अपनाएंगे. That India would maintain a permanent troop presence along its international borders and it would not give an inch. So this was the India-China war. So these are the important developments that took place under assessment of Nehruvian foreign policy. Assessment of Nehruvian foreign policy. What can be said about it? There were some pros and some cons. Pros क्या क्या थे? Write down. Nehru's foreign policy was principled. So it operated along certain principles. And as a result, हुआ क्या? India became a reliable participant. You can say India's foreign policy became predictable. So ऐसा नहीं था कि unpredictable था. India was not a risky player. So other powers could rely upon India to maintain her status quo with respect to various international issues. Was principled, and as a result, क्या लिखा आपने? Nehru's. So it operated along, was principled and So it operated along a predictable path. Predictable path. So this instilled confidence. This instilled confidence among other countries with respect to India's position. India's position. Give me 1 minute. पॉइंट क्या लिखा है? इंडिया emerged as a reliable foreign policy player under Nehru. सेकंड लिखो, Nehru's policy of decolonization, anti-apartheid, decolonization, anti-apartheid, and non-alignment made India a natural leader of the third world. Full stop. Next point. The success of humanity's second experiment with internationalism. First experiment क्या था? League of Nations, that had failed. Second experiment क्या था? United Nations. The success of humanity's second experiment with internationalism, within brackets, the UN, was in large part due to Nehru's belief in its effectiveness. Next, number 4. India was able to obtain developmental assistance and cooperation from both superpowers without sacrificing her strategic autonomy. Without sacrificing her strategic autonomy. Full stop. Next point. Strategic autonomy. Without sacrificing her strategic autonomy. Next point. So it did not become one of the theaters of the Cold War. That is what it means. And at the same time, it was able to get developmental support from both the USA as well as the USSR. Next point. Nehruvian insistence on strong national defense played a direct role in India's future military success against Pakistan. These were the positive features. Negatives क्या है? सबसे बड़ा, write down. However, one of the biggest weaknesses of Nehruvian internationalism was its idealism. Nehruvian internationalism was its idealism. As reflected by the Indochina War, as well as the internationalization of the Kashmir issue. Second problem क्या था? Non-alignment was a very weak move. Why? Because the world was clearly divided into two blocks, and although the non-aligned movement was able to gather as many as 155 member countries by the end, it remained an alliance that was more on paper and less in substance. Okay? The world had clearly become divided into two blocks, and apart from a few countries such as India or Indonesia to a lesser extent, very few were able to resist the pull of the Cold War bloc politics. Okay? And as a result, हुआ क्या? That India was not able to rely upon the backing of the international community to resist either power group. And both the groups considered India hostile. क्यों? क्योंकि आप हमारे साथ नहीं है तो इसका मतलब आप नेचुरली दूसरे वाले के साथ. राइट डाउन. Non-alignment was seen as defiance of influence, defiance of their influence by both superpowers. And thus their attitude towards India remained cool, bordering on hostility. ठीक है. और क्या खामियां थी नेहरूवियन फॉरेन पॉलिसी में? In his desire not to ruffle the feathers when it came to international relations, Nehru even made certain unpalatable compromises. For example, Korean War में aggressor कौन था? It was the North Koreans, the Chinese, and the Soviets. But Nehru, to maintain his neutrality, what did he do? In the UN resolution, which was introduced to name China as one of the aggressors, Nehru abstained. Why? Because he did not want to sour the relations between India and China, and thus also between India and the USSR, because this would be seen as siding with the Americans, right? Therefore, he sacrificed his principles of internationalism to preserve neutrality, right? And this was going to harm India in the future. So, immediately after the end of the Cold War, of the Korean War, SEATO was created. Pakistan was made one of the members. The Americans started to supply war material and assistance, economic assistance to the Pakistanis. And what did the Pakistanis use it against? not to counter China, but to attack India. ठीक है, write down. Nehru's decision to abstain from UN resolution number 48, which named China as one of the aggressors during the Korean War, was seen by the Americans as opportunism. So Nehru had clearly acted to protect neutrality at the cost of the truth. Protect neutrality at the cost of the truth. Stop. Consequently, Pakistan became a member of the SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, SEATO. SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, comma, received American aid and acted against India. Received American aid and acted against India with impunity. Okay? This was the assessment of the Nehruvian foreign policy. Finally, क्या टॉपिक बचा है? Communalism post-independence. सबसे पहले definition of communalism क्या होता है? Write down. When a community, in brackets you can write, it can be either religious or non-religious, begins feeling that its interests social, economic, and cultural, political, and cultural, are not only distinct from the interests of other communities, but also mutually antagonistic, comma, a feeling of hatred, fear, and competition manifests itself. एंड कम्युनलिज्म क्या बोलते हैं? इसको बोलते हैं इसी फीलिंग को. Communalism refers to this feeling. बैकग्राउंड क्या है कम्युनलिज्म का इंडिया में? Is it a historical concept or is it a modern concept in Indian history? Modern concept. देखो, इंडिया इज अ वेरी डाइवर्स नेशन और यहाँ पे अलग अलग कम्युनिटीज प्रेजेंट, रिलीजियस एज वेल एज नॉन रिलीजियस. In history, the relations between these communities may or may not have been adversarial in at certain points in history, there may have been episodes of communal hatred or violence against each other, but the basic nature of Indian society is assimilative in character. Okay? And therefore, with the passage of time, as peace set in, these communities began intermingling with each other, and there was a social synthesis, cultural synthesis. एक composite culture और society का emergence हुआ, in which the social interactions were defined more by cooperation and coexistence and less by conflict and competition. Write down background. Put it into background. Communalism is a modern concept. Communalism is a modern concept. With respect to India. Respect to India. While different religious communities may have shared an adversarial relationship in the past, shared an adversarial relationship in the past, comma, the assimilative character of Indian society assimilative character of Indian society overcame these differences through a lengthy process of cultural synthesis, through a lengthy process of cultural synthesis, of cultural synthesis. Next point. It was during British rule. Was during British rule that communalism emerged as a major political trend. Major political trend. So, this was due to the following factors. This was due to the following factors. क्या factors? सही है. Divide and rule policy of the British. और बताओ. वन से क्या हुआ? Census होना शुरू हुआ and people were categorized according to religion. So clear division between Hindus or sorry Muslims and non-Muslims was created. हिंदूज एक अलग से ग्रुप पहली बार इन्वेंट करके उसका इन्यूमरेशन किया गया, राइट? तो visibly the idea that two separate communities existed in India, that was put forth. Then reservations and separate electorate. This also aided the development of communalism. Then democratic politics with the first past the post system encouraged the division of the electorate into vote banks for different political parties. And कैसे appeal किया? On the basis of religion. Then the activities of communal parties, leaders and groups such as the Muslim League, the Arya Samaj, the Hindu Mahasabha, etc. The inability of the various governments during the 1920s and 30s to prevent communal violence. And the ultimate Pakistan demand and partition of India following a very painful process of communal writing. Right? So these were the factors for the growth of communalism in India during the colonial period. Write down the these include A, following factors. A, the decadal census, decadal census from 1881 onwards, divided Indians on the basis of religion, Number two, the divide and rule policy adopted by the British following the revolt of 1857. Number three, popular democracy involving first past the post system. First past the post system. Post. नहीं सुना कभी? First past the post system. यानी कि इलेक्शंस में जीतने के लिए किसी भी सीट से क्या चाहिए होता है? डू यू नीड अ मेजॉरिटी ऑफ द टोटल नंबर ऑफ वोटर्स? नो, सिंपली द सपोर्ट ऑफ द लार्जेस्ट प्रपोर्शन ऑफ वोटर्स. मान लो 5 कैंडिडेट्स खड़े हुए हैं, किसी को मिला है 20%, किसी को मिला है 20%, मिला है 19%, 18%, किसी को मिला है 22%. तो किसी के पास मेजॉरिटी है नहीं, लेकिन विनर कौन होगा? केवल ये वाला. एंड if you are able to get the support of only 22% of the electorate, your election is guaranteed. ये कौन से ग्रुप्स होंगे? माइनॉरिटी ग्रुप्स होंगे, वोट बैंक पॉलिटिक्स में, या तो कास्ट ग्रुप हो गए, लिंग्विस्टिक ग्रुप हो गए, रिलीजियस ग्रुप हो गए, इनको आप अपील करोगे तो इट इज वेरी इजी सिक्योर दी सीट. ठीक है, क्या लिखा आपने? पॉपुलर डेमोक्रेट, हाँ, पॉपुलर डेमोक्रेसी विद द फर्स्ट पास द सॉरी एग्जैक्ट लाइन, first past the post system encouraged vote bank politics. कितने हुए? 4, 3, बट 4 लिखो. Reservation and separate electorates to religious minorities to religious minorities. Next, number 5. Parties and groups such as the Muslim League, Hindu Mahasabha, and Arya Samaj regularly engaged regularly engaged in dangerous communal rhetoric, dangerous communal rhetoric, mass communalization, number 5, mass communalization during the Khilafat movement. Number 6, series of communal riots during the 1920s and 30s, during the 1920s and 30s. Next, Pakistan demand and the partition of India. Pakistan demand and the partition of India. ठीक है. Next heading though, communalism post-independence. Communalism post-independence. After the initial surge of communalism, following partition, comma, the government cracked down. Government cracked down on right-wing Hindu groups. Right-wing Hindu groups. Following the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. The assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. Next point. As a result, the 1950s remained peaceful. Remained peaceful. Next main point. However, a major communal riot at Jabalpur shocked the nation. Shocked the nation. Forcing the government to enact new laws increase security and clamp down on local leaders. However, the 1960s remained disturbed. point. The 1970s were relatively peaceful. 1970s were relatively peaceful. With the emergency period, being the most peaceful. The 1980s were a turning point for Indian communalism. With the Shah Bano case, followed by the decision to open the Babri Masjid to Hindu devotees, being the greatest contributor to rising communalism. शाह बानो केस क्या था? सुप्रीम कोर्ट में एक केस गया ऑफ अ मुस्लिम लेडी कॉल्ड शाह बानो. Her husband had divorced her suddenly, triple talaq ke through, and according to the Muslim personal law, he only had to pay her restitution for the iddat period, that is only 90 days. Right? However, the Supreme Court had judged that Shah Bano deserved restitution, and it was also considering making the triple talaq provision null and void. However, in order to appease Muslims, Rajiv Gandhi's government introduced a law in parliament which upheld the Muslim person. Okay? So this was condemned by the Hindu groups as a kind of minority appeasement. Now, in order to overcome that mistake, another mistake was made in 1950s. It was decided that the gates of the Babri Masjid would now be flung open to the Hindu devotees. And वहाँ पर outside the premises, outside the main enclosure, एक shed establish कर दिया जाएगा. That was the Ramlala birthplace, and over there devotees would be allowed to worship. Now, this was seen as majority appeasement by the Muslim community, and the tensions started to rise. Next main point, rising communalism. The 1990s witnessed communalism reach its boiling point. Due to issues such as रथ यात्रा 1990 में हुआ, 1990 से शुरू हुआ रथ यात्रा, क्रॉस बॉर्डर टेररिज्म, violence against Kashmiri Pandits, Babri Masjid demolition, Babri Masjid demolition, 1992, and Bombay serial bomb blasts in 93. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट पॉइंट लिखो और सब पॉइंट लिखो. The government responded by setting up anti-terrorism task forces, anti-terrorism task forces, comma, introducing preventive detention laws, and cracking down on suspicious activity, both at the local and national levels. Both at the local and national levels. However, the 90s decades remained disturbed. Next main point. In the new millennium, the atmosphere was poisoned by the Godhra incident and riots. Next main point. Since the 2010s, already this. Now, since the 2010s, don't know. Since the 2010s, comma, communal harmony has been threatened due to issues such as love jihad, cow protection, mob lynching, and fake reporting, especially on social media. Okay. Next point for conclusion. Communalism has thus remained a persistent problem in Indian politics. And requires a multi-pronged response. Including A, B, C, D. A, improving the law and order machinery. B, holding perpetrators to account. C, holding the local government functionaries responsible for being unable to stop communal rioting. Stop communal rioting. D. Immediate relief to affected persons. F. E. जो भी है. Next one. Organizing mohalla committees including leaders from all communities. Next, the resolution of trivial disputes. Resolution of trivial disputes locally. The resolution of trivial disputes locally. Next, enforcing reasonable restrictions on free speech, especially incendiary speech. Bhadkaऊ speech. Incendiary speech in sensitive areas by political and community leaders. Next, responsible and unbiased reporting. Of communal incidents in the media. Spreading education and awareness, especially among women. Why especially among women? दंगों में पार्टिसिपेट कौन करता है ज्यादातर? Men करते हैं. Women are usually victims. So it is important to empower the women, not only so that they can prevent the outbreaks of communal violence, but also they can protect themselves better, both legally as well as using the law and order machine. Okay? So these may be some of the solutions. Clear? With that, we have covered post-independence India. कोई doubts हो तो please let me know, and you can always get in touch with me even after this. Now, जिन लोगों का भी एंशिएंट या मेडिवल नहीं हुआ है, 15 April से हमारा नया बैच शुरू हो रहा है. फर्स्ट ईयर वन टू कवर एंशिएंट. ठीक है, चलिए, थैंक यू फॉर योर टाइम. सी यू गाइस सून.